This move, a king's knight opening, is a flexible and popular choice that avoids committing to a specific pawn structure early and keeps options open for various positional approaches like hypermodern play or classical development. This move develops a piece and controls central squares, keeping options open for various black defenses like the Indian defenses. This move initiates a king's Indian attack formation, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g2 to control the long diagonal and support a kingside pawn advance. Black prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop, aiming for control of the long diagonal and a flexible pawn structure in response to white's king's Indian attack setup. This move fianchettos the bishop, preparing to control the long diagonal and support a queenside pawn advance, typical of systems aiming for a flexible pawn structure. Developing the bishop to b7 aims to control the long light-squared diagonal, mirroring white's fianchettoed bishop and potentially challenging it later in the game. Castling kingside achieves a crucial developmental goal, securing the king behind a pawn shield and activating the rook, a standard and sensible move in this king's Indian setup. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop, opening up a key diagonal for its influence after further pawn advancement. This move solidifies white's pawn center and opens a clear diagonal for the light-squared bishop to potentially control key central squares later in the game. With d5, black asserts central control and opens the diagonal for the c8 bishop, aiming to contest white's kingside fianchetto and establish a solid pawn presence. This move develops the knight to a centralizing square, supporting the d4 pawn push and preparing for c4 to gain queenside space. Developing the knight to d7 supports the central pawn push, c5, and prepares to potentially reroute the knight to c5 or e5, enhancing piece coordination. This move solidifies white's central pawn presence and prepares for further pawn advances, particularly d4, which aims to control more space and open lines for white's pieces. Developing the bishop to e7 supports the central pawn structure and prepares for castling, fitting well within the common development schemes of this Catalan-like setup. The queen now supports the d4 advance, eyeing the central d5 pawn while preparing potential queenside development and reinforcing the kingside fianchetto. Developing the king to safety is a fundamental principle, and castling now prepares for potential pawn advances in the center while bringing the rook towards central activity. This pawn thrust boldly challenges black's central pawn chain, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and create dynamic play in the center. This move challenges white's central pawn push, aiming to control more space and potentially create an isolated d-pawn for white after pawn exchanges. This move prepares to reinforce the central pawn push e4-e5, potentially opening lines for attack and asserting greater control over the d5 square. This move prepares to reinforce the central pawn tension and potentially challenge white's d3 pawn, aligning with a common structure in many Indian defenses where black aims for a central pawn break. White initiates a pawn break in the center, challenging black's central pawn mass and aiming to open lines for their pieces, particularly the queen's bishop. This exchange of pawns opens the center, creating dynamic possibilities for both sides and potentially leading to an isolated queen's pawn for white if the pawn structure further develops in a certain way. This pawn capture opens the d-file and white intends to leverage the resulting central tension by developing their pieces aggressively. The move rad8 prepares to contest the d-file, a strategically important open file that will likely become a focal point for both sides in the coming middle game. This move reinforces the kingside pawn structure and prepares to potentially advance the g-pawn, creating space for the king and preventing any immediate kingside threats from black's pieces. The bishop redeploys to a more active diagonal, targeting white's central pawn structure and preparing for potential future pawn breaks in the center or kingside. This move supports the d4 square and prepares to develop the queenside knight to b2, aiming for a solid positional setup. The bishop repositions to e5, actively challenging white's central pawn structure and aiming to control key diagonals. This move repositions the rook to defend the b3 pawn and potentially support a later advance on the queenside, anticipating black's thematic pawn breaks. This move prophylactically prevents white's bishop from potentially occupying the strategically important g5 square and also prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight from f1 to g3, potentially supporting a kingside pawn push or attacking weaknesses on the black kingside after maneuvering via h2. Black repositions the bishop to a more active square on the long diagonal, aiming to contest the center and potentially pressure white's queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge black's strong central pawn structure and potentially exploit the open c-file after white's pawn captures. This move boldly challenges white's central pawn structure and seeks to activate black's bishop on d6, aiming for greater piece activity and control of the d5 square. The bishop retreats to c1, defending the pawn on b2 and preparing to redeploy to a more active square, potentially a3, to pressure black's queenside pawn structure. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially launch an attack on the kingside. This knight maneuver prepares to occupy the f5 square, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares on black's kingside after the bishop retreats from d6. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to join the fight on the kingside or contest the d5 pawn. The move a3 serves to prevent black's knight from potentially infiltrating on b4 or d4, while also preparing for a queenside pawn advance like b4 to gain space and pressure. This move prepares for the pawn push, a5, contesting white's queenside space and potentially opening the a-file for black's rook. This move aims to exploit the f5 square as a strong outpost for the knight, potentially forcing concessions from black's kingside or creating attacking chances. This pawn advance seeks to gain queenside space and challenge white's central control by opening lines for black's pieces. The bishop on d2 repositions to eye the d5 pawn and create potential connections for white's rooks, preparing for a more active role in the center and queenside. This pawn break on the queenside aims to exploit the open b-file, create counterplay, and disrupt white's queenside pawn structure after the d4 square becomes more dynamic. This captures the pawn and opens the a-file for potential rook activity, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create attacking chances along the open file. This move challenges white's central control and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, creating counterplay for black's pieces on the queenside. This exchange on the queenside simplifies the position, removing black's advanced pawn and opening the b-file for white's rook, while also eliminating a strong knight outpost for black. This pawn capture opens the c-file for black's rook and challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to gain active piece play. The move 25, n1e3 repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to support the d4 pawn and potentially contest control of the d5 and e4 squares. while preparing for future pawn advances or piece exchanges. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawns and potentially set up tactics against the rook on b1. This move strategically activates the rook to the d-file, creating central pressure and preparing to challenge black's control of the open file, potentially leading to exchanges or further infiltration. This move, 26, a5, is a bold attempt to destabilize white's queenside pawn structure and open new avenues for black's pieces, specifically the rook on d8, by creating play on the queenside. nd5 initiates a powerful central outpost, challenging black's coordination and threatening to exploit the weakened d5 square. This move is a strategic decision to eliminate white's dominant bishop and gain a tempo on the queen, potentially opening lines for black's pieces and simplifying the position. This pawn capture opens the e-file for white's rook and clears the d5 square, potentially allowing for greater piece activity and central control after recapturing with the pawn. This move is a prophylactic repositioning of the king to a safer square, avoiding potential threats along the open g-file and preparing for future defensive maneuvers. This move repositions the rook to better contest the d-file and potentially support a d5 pawn, advance or pressure the opponent's kingside. This move aggressively challenges white's queenside pawns and aims to open lines for black's pieces by creating counterplay on the a-file. This move establishes a strong passed pawn on d6, forcing black to react and potentially creating weaknesses in his pawn structure as he defends it. This move centralizes the queen to support the queenside counterplay, simultaneously preparing to defend the weak d6 pawn and potentially attack the white queen. This exchange removes white's advanced pawn and eliminates black's strong bishop, simplifying the position while opening the c-file for potential activity. This capture opens the b-file for white's rook and allows the queen to re-enter the game on the c-file, creating significant attacking potential. This queen move is a decisive tactical response, immediately recapturing material and creating a dangerous passed pawn on d6, while also threatening the black king and disrupting black's coordination. This move recaptures the pawn on b3, opening the a-file for the rook and contesting the queenside initiative. This rook recapture on b3 aims to restore material balance and exploit the now opened a-file for potential future pressure against black's king. This move challenges white's rook on b3, aiming to activate black's rook and potentially exploit the open b-file for counterplay against white's weakened pawn structure. The move k3 repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to exploit the open c-file and put pressure on black's weakened pawn structure. This move offers material, but more importantly, it activates black's queen and opens lines for counterplay against white's king while aiming to control the crucial c-file. The rook now occupies a more active central file, aiming to support the advanced d-pawn and potentially pressure black's queenside pawns. Black reinforces the pawn on d8 to prevent white's d6 pawn from advancing further and to potentially activate the rook for counterplay on the open d-file. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the e7 square and potentially support a future d6 pawn push or attack the black queen if it ventures to d5. This move attempts to break the strong central control established by white's pawns and introduce tactical complications by creating a passed pawn, but it might overextend black's position given the active nature of white's pieces. This move repositions the rook to the fourth rank, aiming to challenge black's advanced pawn on d6 and potentially create mating threats on the back. Rancor in the center. This move, repositioning the queen to e6, aims to contest the open d-file and simultaneously prepare to defend the compromised pawn structure on the queenside, especially after white's aggressive pawn push on d6. This move 38, qf4, repositions the queen to a more active central square, threatening both the knight on e4 and the pawn on b3, while also preparing to potentially support a kingside attack or defend against black's central pawn push. The move 38, rb6, aims to reposition the rook to a more active square where it can support the queenside pawns and potentially challenge the open file on the d-file, while also defending against white's aggressive knight on e7. The knight repositions to f5, aiming to control key squares and potentially join an attack on black's kingside if white can consolidate their material advantage. This pawn push sacrifices material to open lines towards white's king, aiming to create counterplay despite the material deficit. The move 40, qc1, aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, supporting the advance of the g-pawn and preparing to potentially attack on the kingside, while also covering the d4 pawn. This move, by sacrificing the queen, aims to create counterplay by removing a key attacking piece and opening lines for the remaining pieces to develop, though it relies heavily on precise follow-up play to justify the material deficit.